Yo, what's happening? I wanted to talk about the interview that did take place on the Last Stand podcast with Brian Custer. We know about Brian Custer, the guy that is the head commentator there on Showtime Championship Boxing. We seen him last in the fight card that took place in Uncasville, Connecticut on the previous Saturday. Like I said, he has the podcast, and his recent guest was the WBC featherweight champion, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. And one of the questions that was posed in the podcast there was one thing that has been brought up in the past, particularly within this network here, the Boxing Source Network. As we've talked with Mr. Gary Russell Jr. on numerous occasions over the course of this year. And this was one of the questions that was brought up, and give credit to Mr. Gary Russell Jr. He stays consistent in who he wants to fight. Here it goes.
If it was up to Gary Russell Jr., name your next three opponents. You said this guy next, this guy, this guy.
I want Tank off the rip. I want Tank off the rip. Yeah, I want Tank.
Yeah.
I definitely want Leo. I mean, not Leo. For real. Leo still get his ass. I still get Leo. I still spank Leo. But we gonna scratch him for now, because he just loves us. We're gonna scratch him off the list. So Tank definitely for sure. Lomachenko, I definitely probably want him too. I want him next. I want him out of Tank. Fuck that. He can go before Tank. It don't matter. Them two. And since Terrence said something, I want Terrence. I want to challenge myself. I want to strive for excellence, man. Isn't that what your parents always taught you, to push yourself to be the best that you could possibly be?
Absolutely.
And there you have it. No different than what he was saying back in March or April, around April. We talked to him and we said, hey, who do you want to get at? He said Tank. He said Lomachenko. And he also said Terrence Crawford. We all know what the deal is with him and Terrence Crawford. It's been talked about multiple times what happened over in the Olympic Village. Right? We talked about the whole thing with Lomachenko. You see what happened in the situation leading into that fight on both sides. Gary Russell Jr. did talk about that. How when he was preparing for the fight, he felt like he was on weight. But by the time he hit the scales before fight night, they said he was 5 pounds overweight. So he had to do what he needed to do in order to shed those 5 pounds before being at weight in order to fight Vasyl Lomachenko on that night. So you do have that. And he did say Gervonta Tank Davis. And we said it for months. I'm like, listen, you got Tank Davis, a world champion from Baltimore. You got Mr. Gary Russell Jr., a world champion from Capitol Heights, Maryland. Born out of, the D.C. area. D.C. and Baltimore, we could put them together, make it happen. It would be great for this area here in the Washington, D.C. area. That fight could happen. Actually, that could possibly be the next event for Gervonta Tank Davis. I don't see why it couldn't happen. But here, you kind of see that Gary Russell Jr. has stayed consistent on who he wants to fight next. He's tried to make those fights at 126 pounds. He said, look, you've had guys like Lee Selby, who held the IBF featherweight champion, couldn't make a fight for unification. You had Leo Santa Cruz that had the WBA championship, trying to make unification, couldn't do it. You have Josh Warrington, who is the IBF champion now, tried to make a unification, couldn't do it. You also had Shakur Stevenson as a WBO champion, and he did mention that Shakur Stevenson is probably the only one that may have said that he wanted to step up to fight Gary Russell Jr., but he ended up moving up in weight. So there have been no unifications there at 126. That's why Gary Russell Jr. said that he wants to either try to go at somebody at 130 pounds or 135 pounds. Or, as you've heard, listen, if you want to make something shake at 147, Terrence, we'll make something shake. That's basically what he said. But that tells you what Gary Russell Jr.'s hit list is right now, and that it hasn't really changed since earlier this year. He stays consistent, stays on point, stays on the line, doesn't go off of that. So just wanted to drop that there for you. Be sure to subscribe to the Boxing Source here on YouTube, and we have the podcast live Sunday 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Blog Talk Radio. It's also available on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Anchor.fm, iHeartRadio, whatever you use for your favorite podcast. On that note, folks, till the next video, I'm out. Peace.